Hello and welcome back to our lectures about blood. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about red and white blood cells. I'm going to start by talking about red blood cells. I want to start by reminding you that red blood cells are the most abundant cell type, or not just cell type, but cellular element type in the blood. Okay, and I want to introduce this term to you, hematocrit. Okay, so hematocrit is the percent of the total blood volume that's occupied by red blood cells. So just taking a look at this breakdown right here, can you tell me what the hematocrit is here? So just take a second to look at that. All right, so hopefully you figured out that the hematocrit here is 42%. Okay, moving on. This shows you a little bit about how red blood cells mature. I want to remind you that all of our cellular elements originate ultimately from the pluripotent hematopoietic stem cell. Okay, this shows the maturation process for a red blood cell. So we are differentiating into more specific cell types. And then, and as that happens, the cell kind of shrinks in size, the nucleus condenses, okay? And then right before the red blood cell is ready to enter the circulation, we actually expel the nucleus, and also our organelles break down, okay? And then we end up with our mature red blood cell. So let's take a quick look at mature red blood cells and some of their characteristics, okay? A mature red blood cell is basically just like a little bag that's like chock full of hemoglobin for transporting oxygen, okay? There's also some enzymes in there and water, of course. Hemoglobin is a molecule that transports oxygen and actually also carbon dioxide. We'll be talking about that in the next slide. But for now, let's go over some of the other characteristics of red blood cells. Okay, so red blood cells have this sort of characteristic shape, this kind of flattened, sandwichy donut kind of shape. I don't know what you call it, but I'm sure you all have seen this before. That shape is kind of held that way by the cytoskeleton. Uh, red blood cells are flexible, so they can, well, they're flexible, so they can kind of change shape pretty easily, and that's very important for them because they have to squeeze through the capillaries. So capillaries are kind of just wide enough to let through a single red blood cell. So red blood cells they go through the capillaries single file, okay? So the red blood cell needs to have a little flexibility to kind of make its way through the capillaries. Red blood cells have about a 120-day lifespan, and they lose their flexibility with age, okay? And I have this question for you. So if you remember that mature red blood cells lack membrane-bound organelles, what does that say about their ability to carry out protein synthesis? So think about that for a moment. Okay, so hopefully you have enough of a biology background to know that if you do not have membrane-bound organelles such as a nucleus or an ER, you will not be able to carry out protein synthesis. That is why that the blood cells have this kind of short, like limited lifespan, and that's why they lose that flexibility with age, because they don't have the ability to replace those proteins that are kind of getting old, okay? Okay, so now let's take a closer look at this molecule, hemoglobin, that is in the red blood cells, okay? So hemoglobin is a molecule that has a protein component to it and a non-protein component to it. So looking here, we can see that hemoglobin has basically 4 protein subunits. Those are these like ribbony looking things right here, okay? Typical normal adult hemoglobin is made up of 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains of hemoglobin, okay? Each of those hemoglobin subunits holds a non-protein component called a heme group. Okay, so this is a picture of a heme group. At the center of the heme group is an iron ion, and that iron ion is the binding site for oxygen on the hemoglobin. So since we have 4 subunits that each hold a heme group, that means each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about red blood cells. Now let's move on and say just a little bit about white blood cells. Okay, so white blood cells is one of these topics that's kind of like fuses, where there's just a ton of stuff to say about them, and I'm just going to scrape the surface here. Okay, so as I mentioned before, white blood cells are important for the immune system, so they have an immune function. Okay, there's 5 types of white blood cells. Here are our 5 different types. I'm not going to go over them, but each type has its own role in the immune response. They all have different jobs. I also just want to mention that in the clinic, you can do this thing called a white blood cell count, a differential white blood cell count, where you can look at the relative abundance of these 5 different white blood cell types. And that can tell you something about a disease condition that someone might have. White blood cells are complete cells. Okay, so these are the only cellular element in the blood that actually has all of the parts that you're supposed to have in a cell, like all of the organelles. Okay, and the white blood cells travel in the circulation but work in the tissues. So they travel around in the blood, but they leave the blood and go to the tissues to do their job.